Thanks for joining us today. Today we'll be looking at the Reform software and how it integrates into the RightFAX faxing solution. We'll be going over the communication between Reform and RightFAX to deliver documents in a variable data printing perspective, as well as a MOST perspective, as well as to include scanning from a multifunction device. To get started, the first thing that we're going to do is install the required software. On my server here, I've already installed the basic Reform software, the variable data printing plugin, as well as the MOST plugin. And the configuration of those applications can be found in other videos and tutorials on our website. Before installing the RightFAX plugin to begin our demonstration today, I'm going to install the RightFAX client. The RightFAX client is required to communicate with the RightFAX server. It allows our application to not only deliver faxes through RightFAX, but also return statuses, confirmation pages, and allow the user to search context through RightFAX as well. To start the installation, I'm just going to run the setup on the RightFAX client the same way I normally would on a desktop PC. And I'm going to go through the basic wizard. Once I reach a screen where it prompts for a typical client, admin client, or custom, I'm going to select custom on my server. And the reason being, on my server, I don't necessarily require the print driver or the Outlook fax extensions for RightFAX. So I'm going to remove those as they're unnecessary. Now as we proceed, the requirements for RightFAX and the RightFAX fax utility are going to be installed. Okay, the prerequisites have been completed, and now the faxutil software will be installed. We're going to continue using the default folder location. The wizard now asks for a RightFAX server name, and I'm going to enter it based on my environment. And the installation should be complete now. Now, before I proceed and install the Reform software that communicates with RightFAX, I'd like to just verify that the RightFAX server is communicating properly. To do that, I'm just going to go to my Start menu and browse to Programs, Open Text, and I'm going to open the faxutil. Now, in my case, the account I'm using doesn't have access to RightFAX, so I'm going to enter a set of credentials that does. Here I'm going to use an administrator account for the purposes of this demo, just to simplify the browsing of faxes. Because we'll be sending faxes as multiple accounts, the administrator account, in my case, will allow me to view those documents much simpler. So here I can see in the faxutil that I'm connected to RightFAX, and I'm able to communicate with it. The next step I'd like to do is to install the software for Reform that communicates with RightFAX. And I'll be installing the Reform RightFAX plugin, which can be downloaded from our website. The Reform RightFAX installation has now completed, and it will allow us to send variable data documents through the RightFAX server. What I'm going to do next is to demonstrate how that can be done and do kind of a live walkthrough of how to configure the document to be sent through the fax server. To begin, I'm going to start by configuring the services that are installed with this plugin. To do that, I'm going to open the Reform Health Monitor by going to Start, Programs, Reform, Monitoring, and Health Monitor. The Health Monitor is a convenient way of maintaining and configuring your server. And in this case, we're going to be configuring the Reform services. Now you'll notice the services that were installed with the basic software, including Reform and Most, have already been configured to use my desired service account. However, the new RightFAX service that was just installed is not configured yet. I'm going to use the option here to change the service account for this RM RightFAX monitor. After entering the credentials, we receive a prompt saying that the change to the account was successful and that the service needs to be restarted before the change takes effect. I'm going to select yes to restart the service now. Here we can see the service is now running as a desired account and should have all the required permissions for my environment. The next steps that we'll be continuing with is to configure Reform and Most to interact with RightFAX from a multifunction printer. To begin that scenario, I'm going to go ahead and install the Reform Most plugin, which adds additional abilities to the software. Again, this installation is available from the FabSoft website, and it only takes a moment to install. Once the software is installed, the first step to begin configuring the software is to import the RightFAX screens into the Most designer. To do that, I'm going to go to my Start menu again, and under Reform, Most for RightFAX, I'll find a shortcut for installing Most screens. Clicking that shortcut will prompt to import these screen designs into the Most designer. I'm going to go ahead and select yes when it's prompting. Now that the screen designs are configured in Most, my next step is to grant users access to these screen designs. To do that, I'm going to go into the Data menu and select Users and Groups. For today's demonstration, we're going to configure the domain users as well as the demo account to have access to the RightFAX screens. To begin, I'm going to select domain users on the side here, and I'm going to move RightFAX from the available collections to the selected collections. I'm also going to move it up in the list so that it's the first screen we see as we log in. I'm going to repeat the same steps using the demo account to give that user access to RightFAX as well. I can now save those changes. Now we have created the screens, assign them to specific users, and the next step is to configure them to communicate with RightFAX. To configure RightFAX, I'm now going to go to the Data Global Variables section of the designer, and here there's several settings that we can enter. Going in order, I'm going to enter the RightFAX administrator user and password for my environment. Now, a common question is, why does most and Reform require administrative credentials to RightFAX? And the reason is, to send on behalf of specific accounts, we'll need to impersonate those users, and the administrator account is the only account that has that type of permission. The next setting I'm going to configure is the RightFAX proxy username and proxy auto detect. These settings allow users that don't have access to RightFAX to send fax documents through a designated RightFAX account. So you may have users that are maybe external contractors in your environment, or users that don't belong to your domain that are still required to send faxes out. This allows us to set up a specific designated account that those external users can send documents through. The account I'm using here is called Reform Proxy. We'll be demonstrating this proxy account as we use the demo user on most. I'm now going to enter the server name for my environment. And last are the SQL credentials. Another common question is, why do we need SQL connections for RightFAX to function properly? And the answer is, for most on the MFP to query or search the user's RightFAX contacts, we do a database search to the SQL server. So here I'm going to enter the SQL credentials for my RightFAX database. Okay, now that I've configured all of the settings, I'm going to save my changes, and I can now exit the MOST designer. The next step is to continue with the SQL database configuration for RightFAX, because we've only entered the credentials, yet we haven't specified where the database exists. To do that, we need to create an Odbc connection to the RightFAX server, or RightFAX SQL server. Now, because the software is running as 32-bit, and my environment here on my server is 64-bit, I need to be sure to run the 32-bit Odbc Manager. To do that, I'm going to specifically enter the entire path to the Odbc Manager. So in my case, the application is found under C, Windows, syswow64, Odbc ad32.exe. Now, if you were on a 32-bit server, essentially the path would be C, Windows, System32, and then /Odbc ad32.exe. And it's important to make sure you're using the correct version of this Odbc Manager. I'm going to continue and create a System Dsn, and I'm going to click the Add button with a SQL Server driver. I'm going to name this DSN connection RightFAX. And it's important to use that name for the software to automatically locate it properly. For the server, I'm going to enter the SQL server that is holding my RightFAX information. I'm now going to specify the desired authentication type. We could use Windows authentication or SQL authentication. In this case, I'm going to use SQL. Just to reference back to the global variables that I had entered earlier in the most designer, I used the same credentials in my global variables as I did in the Odbc Manager. If, for instance, I wanted to use Windows authentication, that could also be done by leaving the credentials in the most designer blank for the SQL Server. And in that case, the reform service account, or RightFAX reform service account, would need to have authentication or permission to your SQL Server. I'm going to continue to configure the DSN to my database, and here we can see it completed successfully. Now that all my settings are configured, I can continue with a test application to check all of my settings. To run the test application, I'm going to go back to the Start menu, and under Reform, Most RightFAX, you'll find a connection test utility. Now, as I click each of the buttons 1 through 5, it'll either prompt or display a successful message. So I'm going to continue through each of the 5 tests, and you can see as I click on the buttons, the successful message appears next to it. And on the last test, we can see that I have successfully completed my configuration. Now that Reform and Most are both configured to communicate with RightFAX, our last step before we begin sending fax documents is to restart the services. The reason we need to restart the services is because after they were already running, we installed new software. To ensure that all of the new software that was installed and the changes we made take effect, restarting the services is the safest way to ensure that. Again, I'm going to go to the Reform Health Monitor. I'm going to browse to the service configuration, and here we can use the options to stop and start all services. Okay, at this point, we're ready to begin sending documents through Most to RightFAX. To accomplish this, I'm going to use a copy machine here. And to begin, I'm going to log in as a domain user. And the user account that I'm logging in as is a Windows account that has permission to send faxes through RightFAX. It has a personal RightFAX account. And to log in, I'm going to use a proximity card to just swipe and authenticate. And here we can see the first screen that I have access to is RightFAX, just as we configured it. You'll notice that on the screen I have 3 contacts. I also have a way to search my fax book. So in this case, if I search for the letter M, you'll notice 2 recipients or 2 contacts appear in my list. There's also a speed dial option to search for contacts, which adds a little bit more flexibility to the way that contacts are found, whether they're in public phone books, and how they're configured in RightFAX can affect how the speed dial search results appear. Along the left side, I also have access to other screens. The screen we're looking at now allows us to search contacts, while the next screen only allows us to enter a name, notes, and a fax number manually. The third screen we have access to is for fax statuses, and here we can see that I have no fax records in my account so far. And the last three allow us to add, edit, and delete phone book contacts in RightFAX. So any contacts that I've created within the RightFAX fax util software will appear on the MFP, and vice versa. Any contacts that I modify at the MFP will be modified in the fax util software as well. To send a fax, I'm going to go back to the lookup ability, and I'm going to select a recipient and add them as a recipient for this document. I'm then going to go ahead and add notes to this fax. And the same way I would normally do, I'll insert the paper and scan my document. Here we can see a preview, and since the document does show the way that I would expect it to, I'm going to press on Finish. I'm now going to switch to the status screen, where the MFP will periodically refresh the statuses of my documents. And this allows us to give real-time statuses to the users at the MFP. You'll also notice that the status says waiting to be sent at this moment. And this status matches the RightFAX fax utility exactly. If we open the fax utility and we browse to the account that I'm using for this demonstration, you'll notice that the status has just changed to printing, and on the MFP it is also printing. The reason that the status is currently printing is that once a document has been faxed, the Reform software will actually print a confirmation page back to the user so that they're aware that the document was sent successfully or if it had failed. Here we can see that the fax confirmation is printed out with some basic information on top and with the document that I had faxed so that I'm aware of what paper this is referring to. Now we're going to go ahead and add some contacts to the recipients. If I go to the Add Phone Book screen, here I can enter the name, fax number, and other information for any recipient that I'd like to add to the system. You'll notice that if I enter the incorrect fax numbers or different fax numbers, the machine will even prompt me to ensure that I correct the mistake. Now that I've added the contact, I can go back to the faxing screen, and within moments I should be able to search for that user or that person, and here he is. Now, let's say that the fax number has changed for this contact. I can always go to Edit and search for that person again. Or in this case, I'll leave the search blank so that all contacts appear. And I can change his information. I missed some required information, so again, the MFP will prompt to ensure that I enter it. And after a few moments, I can search for that contact again, and the fax number should be updated. If, for example, I wanted to remove a contact, similarly, I could use the delete screen to search and remove the entry that I have created. I could simply select the contact and press the remove button. Now again, just to reiterate, any contacts that I create or search for at the MFP also exist in the RightFAX FAXutil software. They stay synchronized and they're always up to date because we're using the RightFAX database to query for contacts. The next thing I'd like to do is to use the demo account to send a fax. And what this is going to demonstrate is rather than having a user that exists on my network, I'm going to use an account that might be used by an external contractor. In this case, my demo account has access to nothing on my environment, nothing on my network, as well as nothing on the RightFAX server. And what we expect to see when we scan through this account is that the fax will actually be sent through my proxy account that I specified. Here I'm just logging in as the demo user. Now this user doesn't have any contacts in their RightFAX because they don't have a RightFAX account. So in this case, I'm going to use the manual screen as part of the demonstration. And I'm going to manually enter the name and fax number that I'm going to be using. Again, I'm going to insert the paper as I normally would and scan the document. Once I verify that the preview shows the document the way that I expect, I can press Finish, and the scan will be sent to the RightFAX server. Again, we can go back to the status, and here we'll see the current status is pending submission. And you'll notice it doesn't show the statuses for the fax that was sent by the other account. The statuses available to each user are based on their account and the username that they use to authenticate at the MFP. If we look at the FAXutil, at the Reform Proxy user, we'll notice the fax document that we had just scanned. You'll notice it's printing the confirmation page as we speak. And the last thing you'll notice is under the account column, the name demo. And that's how we distinguish which user had actually scanned the document. So although the Reform Proxy user is a generic account, every person that scans through that account is still identifiable. We still know who scanned the document or who is responsible for scanning it. This also allows us to provide specific users with their own statuses. Going back to the MFP, we can see that the confirmation page is just printed out, again, with some basic information about the fax on top and with the fax document on the other side. The last thing I'd like to demonstrate is the ability to print the history of a fax. On the status screen, we can select the document that we want to see the history of and check the box on top to print history, as well as whether we'd like to see all of the fax pages or only some of them. So I'm going to go ahead and just do the first page only and request the print. And in a few moments here, the history of this fax document will print out at the device. And that's essentially our demonstration for today. Just to kind of go over what we've covered again, we simulated a variable data printing job where the data stream contained multiple fax numbers, and we sent the faxes as two separate documents. It successfully communicated with RightFAX, and we could verify that by using the fax utility software. We then continued to expand on that ability by installing the RightFAX for Most application or plugin. And once configured, we could modify and search contacts in RightFAX. We could send documents from the MFP, as well as view real-time statuses and receive confirmation pages at each MFP. We also went over the fact that users, whether they personally have a RightFAX account, or if they do not, still have the ability to utilize the RightFAX integration from Reform. Are there any questions?
No, Matt, it's really good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.